Well, welcome. It's rained, so everybody feels better. And I think you'll be very happy that you came out tonight for what promises to be a very provocative and timely lecture. I am Professor Karen Adams from the University of Montana's Department of Political Science, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening. First, though, I want to thank the President's Office for sponsoring the President's Lecture Series, from which we all benefit so much here on campus. Michael Scheuer received a BA from Canisius College, master's degrees from Niagara University and Carleton University, and a PhD from the University of Manitoba. Dr. Scheuer is a 22-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency with experience in national security issues, especially related to Afghanistan, South Asia, and Islamic militancy. From 1996 to 1999, he worked at CIA headquarters in Washington, D.C., heading the unit charged with pursuing Osama bin Laden. From 2001 to 2004, he served as that unit's senior advisor. Dr. Scheuer is the author of 3 best-selling books: Imperial Hubris, Why the West is Losing the War on Terror; Through Our Enemy's Eyes, Osama bin Laden, Radical Islam, and the Future of America. And his most recent book is Marching Toward Hell, America and Islam After Iraq. Dr. Scheuer frequently appears on national and international news programs and is an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown University. Tonight, his topic is Marching Towards Hell, America and Islam After Iraq. Dr. Scheuer will speak for about 40 minutes, and then he will be happy to take your questions. There are microphones here on the 2 outer aisles, so if you have a question at the end of the talk, just line up behind the microphone, and we'll have, I'm sure, a very lively discussion. Please help me welcome Dr. Michael Scheuer.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great honor for me to be here tonight. I always get a little nervous before I speak to an audience. I pursued a profession that discouraged that kind of behavior. And when I first resigned from the agency in 2004, the National Security Agency was kind enough to ask me to come up and talk to a group of their officers. And there were about 300 people in the audience. And I had never, of course, talked to that many people before. And I guess I was feeling a little cocky. And I told my children, who were 9 and 10 at the time, that I was going to talk to 300 people tomorrow in an audience. And they kind of shrugged and they said, you know, without saying it, so what? They walked away, and my daughter turned around, who was the youngest of the 2, and said, "Don't worry, Dad. Sister Mary Lawrence makes us listen to people we don't want to hear either." So I hope at the end of the evening you don't feel like Sister Mary Lawrence made you come in tonight. I have had in the past 2 weeks the humbling honor to speak to hospitable audiences on or near the birthdays of the 2 greatest Americans, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. In Pennsylvania last week, I told the audience that on the birthday of the 2nd greatest American, Mr. Lincoln, that they were to suffer through a talk by someone who probably would not be ranked in the top 300 million of all Americans. That said, I'm now a bit more confident that my place among my countrymen will at least always be higher than that of Attorney General Holder. Holder last week despicably described Americans as cowards on the issues of race, thereby deliberately and ahistorically dishonoring the 630,000 white and black Americans who died in the war that ended slavery in the United States, and the several thousand more black, white, Hispanic, and Asian who have died in the courageous pursuit of the always elusive goal of full racial equality. Regretfully, Attorney General Holder's current prominence is just one more piece of evidence that in American party politics, the dregs of all races far too often rise to the top. Today here in Montana, you have asked me to speak on the day after the birthday of the greatest American, George Washington. If fully eclipsed by Mr. Lincoln's shadow, I am surely obliterated by that of the great and good Washington. Perhaps the best I can do, then, is to frame this talk in the words General Washington once used when discussing the absolutely vital importance of making sure that the American people clearly understand the threats they confront at home and abroad. I am sure that the mass of the citizens of these United States mean well, Washington wrote to John Jay in 1796, and I firmly believe that they will always act well whenever they can obtain a right understanding of matters. A year ago this month, I published a book entitled Marching Toward Hell, America and Islam After Iraq. The book's goal was to try and persuade my countrymen that they did not have what Washington called a right understanding of America's war with Islamist militancy. As were my earlier books, Marching Toward Hell is meant to acquaint Americans with the nature of the threat they face from Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamists they lead and incite. And again, as in my previous work, I argue in this book that the United States government, under both parties, has been and is fighting an Islamist enemy that does not exist and is employing policies that run counter to our country's historical tradition and so to its best interests. Washington's Islamist enemy is the stuff of a Hollywood farce, a limited band of fanatic nihilists ready to kill widely and indiscriminately for the pure joy of murdering, and ready to sacrifice their lives because my daughters go to university, people in Iowa hold early presidential primaries every 4 years, and because I, may God forgive me, have one or more Canadian club and sodas after work. Would that such an enemy existed, for he would be at most a lethal nuisance and not the national security threat posed today by the Islamist movement symbolized and inspired by Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and their allies. This farcical view of America's Islamist enemy is unfortunately endemic in both U.S. political parties, much of the U.S. and Western media, and perhaps most damagingly, almost all of the academy. It is my assessment that this view is almost entirely without substantiation. And if it continues to be the working assumption of the United States government, America will be slowly but surely defeated through the loss of prestige, blood, financial solvency, and domestic political cohesion. We will lose not because the enemy is militarily stronger than we are. That certainly is not the case. Indeed, America's myopic governing elite has taken an enemy who in military capability is at most a puny 4'7" tall, even in high heel sandals, and made him into a 10-foot tall and still growing behemoth. Why has this happened? It has happened because the members of America's bipartisan governing elite are rank and reckless interventionists. From President Bush to President Obama, from Speaker Pelosi to Mayor Giuliani, from Vice President Cheney to Vice President Biden, from the New York Times to the Washington Times, and from Fox News to National Public Radio, America's leaders, left, center, and right, believe there is no political problem, war, revolution, ethnic conflict, gender equality deficiency, crooked election, jailed female poet, or religious clash that does not require direct American involvement, and this whether or not they can identify even a single genuine U.S. national interest that's at risk. In making this claim, I do not for an instant suggest that I can read the minds or hearts of the men and women who have disastrously misdirected our foreign policy in the Muslim world for more than 30 years. Because no human has this sort of divine insight, I can only take as my guide President Washington's assertion that the views of men can only be known or guessed at by their words or actions. Using this metric, the pervasive, bipartisan, and doctrinaire, one is tempted to use the adjective rabid, interventionism of our leaders emerges in sharp and even indelible relief. And it is in this relentless interventionism that we find the real motivation of America's Islamist enemies, as well as the organizational glue that provides that diverse movement's always fragile cohesion. The Islamists' motivation is to be found in their perception of U.S. foreign policy as an attack on the Islamic religion and its followers, a view that is held not only by those carrying AK-47s, but if recent polling can be deemed reliable, by nearly 80% of all Muslims worldwide. Now, no American must accept the Islamists' indictment of the anti-Muslim intent of U.S. foreign policy. But to avoid eventual defeat, U.S. leaders must acknowledge and then explain to the American people that this is indeed the Muslim world's perception, and that our security requires that we all accept the truism that perception is always reality. And what are the policies that motivate the Islamists? I can do no better than to list the 6 U.S. policies bin Laden enumerated in the fall of 1996 and has held very closely to ever since. First, the U.S. military and civilian presence on the Arabian Peninsula. Second, U.S. and Western exploitation of Muslim energy resources. Third, the U.S. military's presence in Muslim lands outside the Arabian Peninsula. Fourth, U.S. support for nations that oppress Muslims, especially U.S. support for Russia, China, and India. Fifth, unqualified U.S. support for Israel. And sixth, U.S. support and protection for Muslim tyrannies. These 6 policies, then, form the core of the Islamist motivation for waging war on America. And while U.S. citizens can debate whether the policy status quo should be kept, or one or more of the policies should be amended or abandoned, it is likely that the maintenance of Washington's prevailing operating assumption that Muslims hate Americans for who they are and how they live, and not for what the U.S. government does in the Islamic world, will lead to nothing less than a vast and willful case of self-deception that will ultimately yield calamity for the nation. In the United States today, as I'm sure you can imagine, the foregoing line of analysis is not in the mainstream. Indeed, it is likely to be dismissed as pathological. And yet, 13 years after al-Qaeda declared war on America, the cynical act of political expediency in Iraq, known as the Surge, is unraveling. The war in Afghanistan is lost beyond recall. Pakistan is in danger of going the way of Afghanistan, with untold consequences for nuclear proliferation. The Mujahideen bleed through from Iraq is visible in Jordan, Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, Palestine, and Israel. The Islamist insurgencies in Somalia and in Algeria have been rekindled, with the Somali Mujahideen nearing victory. Similar insurgencies of varying but building vitality are underway in southern Thailand, in Mindanao, and in the North Caucasus. The major Hindu cities of India are being attacked by Islamist fighters almost at will, and the Islamist movement in Western Europe is growing, and at least in Great Britain, has driven the traditionally stoic security services to the point of public despair. As for the United States, bin Laden has delineated al-Qaeda's war aims for defeating America in 3 concise phrases. First, to bleed America to bankruptcy. Second, to spread out U.S. military and intelligence forces to sap their flexibility and their reserves. And third, to undermine domestic political unity in the United States as much as possible. I will leave it to this audience to decide, given these 3 war aims to use as a metric, whether there is any reason for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda to be discouraged about the amount of progress they have made in the war they declared on us in 1996. Now let me move to the next part of this talk by suggesting that the best foreign policy advice for the new administration, in fact for every U.S. administration, has been heard by anyone who has flown on a civilian domestic airliner. During the pre-flight security briefing, each passenger is told that in the case of an emergency, place your own oxygen mask on first and only then help others with theirs. I referred to this common sense instruction in Marching Toward Hell. I believed in its direct pertinence to U.S. foreign policy then, and I believe it even more strongly today. Before America and the precious few of our allies who are able and willing to fight can defeat the expanding Islamist movement, and beat it we must, and with as much military power as needed, and certainly far more than we have used to date, the U.S. government must first put its own political and foreign policy houses in order. America can help no alliance partner or other foreign nation until it is re-anchored in its own history and traditions. And to do that, we must return to the design of government crafted by General Washington and the other founders. Indeed, until such a reordering occurs, America cannot even help itself. In foreign policy, the key to this re-anchoring is a return to an independent and non-interventionist foreign policy. If there be one principle more deeply rooted in the mind of every American, Mr. Jefferson wrote in 1791, it is that we should have nothing to do with conquest. In America's war with Islam, we are losing because our bipartisan governing elite and its academic and media apologists have turned Mr. Jefferson on his head, much to the nation's detriment. Once elected, the leaders of both parties automatically and often mindlessly intervene in the affairs of other nations and regions. If you doubt this, recall the early February speech by Vice President Biden in Europe, in which he claimed that the United States would make common cause with European nations who feel threatened by Russia. No nation had called for such a public declaration, thus fulfilling the automatic part of the equation, and Biden's pledge came just as Washington had fatally given Moscow control over our major non-Pakistani resupply routes into Afghanistan for US and NATO forces, thus meeting the equation's mindless requirement in spades. Such knee-jerk interventionism has been the hallmark of US policy in the Muslim world since at least 1973. And its main achievement has been to create a slate of policies that leaves us with few options in the region and all but guarantees endless wars with Muslims. Foreign policy is, of course, about creating options for use and protecting genuine national interests. But when Americans celebrated Independence Day last July in the midst of a presidential election year, neither Senator Obama nor Senator McCain had the moral courage to tell Americans the truth, which is that over the last 35 years, both parties have consciously eviscerated US independence on the single most important foreign policy issue, the decision on whether or not to go to war. Both parties, for example, have failed to move the United States to energy security since the first Saudi-led embargo in 1973. Instead of freeing the US economy from the Arab-held dagger pointed at its heart, American presidents, Republican and Democrat, have unmanfully groveled and begged for more oil from their energy-producing masters in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the other Arab states. The same presidents have so enormously overspent the public treasury that America also is now further in the thrall of the same Arab tyrants who, with China, buy an ever-increasing portion of our debt. Because of such leadership, Americans will find that they have lost the control of the decision of whether to go to war. If anti-Saudi unrest in the kingdom's eastern province ever seriously curtails oil production, US soldiers and Marines will automatically deploy to defend and secure the Saudi police state and to restore production. And the reality of automatic war for oil goes far beyond the Arab world. Currently, Mexico is one of our top oil suppliers, and it is creeping ever closer to the status of a failed state. And by 2012, the United States will import 20% of its crude from the Niger Delta. If production in either of these places, and both are already beset by an insurgency, is ever significantly reduced, US soldiers and Marines will be automatically deployed there to restore production. And if you think the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan are nightmares, just wait until US forces are fighting in the Niger Deltas, 27,000 square kilometers of forest and swamp. As for Mexico, I can only think that our governing elite's criminal negligence of enforcing the indispensable component of national defense known as effective border control has set up America for a national tragedy of Shakespearean proportion. A tragedy that will be of our own making, and one that, once initiated, will unfold rapidly and bring with it the possibility of significant violence in parts of the United States. America also has lost control of the peace or war decision because its leaders in both parties have involved them almost inextricably in the unending and unendable war between Arabs and Israelis. Ignoring and even ridiculing the founders' explicit guidance to avoid getting involved in other people's wars, both parties not only have involved us in the Middle East, but there they have involved us in other people's religious wars. Can there be a better definition of an insane foreign policy than the one that today finds the United States not only involved to the hilt in other people's religious wars, but backing both of the major antagonists in that war, Israel and Saudi Arabia? By being the cash cow for and the unquestioning protector of Israel, and the only protector of the fundamentally anti-American Saudi state, Washington has created a situation in which America will be drawn into any Arab-Israeli war that includes any Arab state beyond Palestine, no matter what the wishes or interests of the American people. Having thus all but negated the ability of the United States to abstain from wars for oil and major wars between Arabs and Israelis, the US political elite has completed its axis of doom for Americans through their apparently limitless zeal for overseas democracy crusading, a perversion of what America stands for that can only lead to war and more war. The American elite's democracy crusading in Iraq has destabilized the entire region, creating new threats to oil supplies and making the price of oil almost entirely unpredictable. It also has cost the American taxpayers nearly $1 trillion, killed more than 4,200 of their soldier children, and wounded 30,000 more, and has set the stage for a potential region-wide Sunni-Shia civil war. A few more such missions accomplished in the democracy-building realm will bankrupt our nation. And the still pending threat of another war to impose democracy, this time in Iran, which is, of course, a more representative regime than any of Washington's Islamo-fascist Arab allies, would be a negative achievement of Homeric proportions. War in Iran would be billed as a war to liberate oppressed Iranians or to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. But in reality, it would be, like Iraq, nothing more than another war to protect Israel. Such a war, moreover, might well temporarily unite the entire Muslim world, 1.4 billion Muslims if you are counting, in a war against the United States. If any additional proof is needed of the ingrained lust of American politicians to intervene where no US interests are at stake, just recall that President Obama and Senator McCain both took time out of their campaigns last summer to praise and welcome the independence of Kosovo, thereby helping the quite mad Europeans light the fuse to the next Balkans war. And later in the summer, both men paused again after Russia invaded Georgia to urge the rapid admission of Georgia to NATO, apparently eager to give the Georgians the same sort of unredeemable and war-causing security guarantee that Great Britain gave to Poland in 1939. America's bipartisan governing elite then, with the support of the media and the academy, has brought the United States face to face with war at every turn. Wars over oil, wars over the religious conflicts in which no genuine US national interest is at stake, and wars to impose secular democracy on people who will fight it to the death. This situation is surely the antithesis of what the founders intended when they designed a constitutional system meant to limit the chance of arbitrary government, a kind of government that inevitably leads to tyranny. The founders knew, and contemporary Americans are painfully learning, that there are few better definitions of tyranny than one that finds an entire nation repeatedly led into wars where no national interests are at stake by the personal beliefs, ambitions, or even whims of a single individual, be he or she a monarch, a dictator, or a popularly elected president. To have a chance of defeating America's Islamist enemies, U.S. leaders must be made to abandon their half-century binge of interventionism and begin to rebuild a viable American republic to replace America's collapsing Jacobin attempt at empire. The question is, of course, how to begin to retrieve the blank check war commitments U.S. leaders have given to foreigners. In the context of the new Obama administration, let me suggest several ways of proceeding. First, America must accelerate conversion to alternative energies, expand nuclear power, and further exploit U.S. fossil fuel reserves. Nothing should be allowed to deter the ingenuity and initiative of Americans from gaining energy self-sufficiency. Demands for the absolute protection of Arctic hares, the Gulf of Mexico's shrimp-inhabited reefs, or the sunny Pacific waters off California, at the cost of dead Marines and soldiers, should be ignored. Beyond oil, America has no national interests in the Arab Peninsula region, save the freedom of navigation that the U.S. Navy can assure. And as our energy dependence ends, this will become clear. Self-sufficiency will allow America to stop protecting the Gulf's tyrannies, which now cloud our economic destiny, steadily export a religious hatred for us, far more virulent than anything advocated by bin Laden, and make our advocacy of freedom and democracy appear to be pure and even spectacular hypocrisy. It also will end the current cruel reality that sees some portion of the price U.S. parents pay at the pump flow from oil-rich Arabs to the Islamic insurgents who are killing their soldier children in Iraq and Afghanistan. Second, this country must stay out of other people's wars, particularly their religious wars. America now stands as an abject loser in the Israel-Hezbollah conflict, the Israel-Palestine war, the economic strangling of Hamas, and the recent Israeli invasion of Gaza. Indeed, America is in part losing to bin Laden and the Islamist movement because of its absolute backing of Israel and the consistent blind eye it has turned toward the Saudis' blatant and aggressive jihad spreading. America must withdraw from this savagery. No important aspect of American life or security would be negatively impacted if Palestine or Israel or both disappeared tomorrow. And we are tied to the Saudi tyranny only because of the craven failure of U.S. politicians to move the country toward greater energy self-sufficiency. Americans also must reject their political class's patently absurd contention that U.S. and Israeli national security interests are identical. America is now shedding blood and treasure in Iraq because of this country's Israel First citizens and their journals. Men like Douglas Feith and Paul Wolfowitz, Rahm Emanuel and Norman Podhoretz, and Victor Davis Hanson, and their journals such as the Weekly Standard, the National Review, Commentary, and the Wall Street Journal. These men and their publications provoked a hubristic war based on the idiot idea that a democratic state could be created in Muslim Iraq that was not anti-Israeli. In doing so, they severely and permanently compromised Israel's security from the very moment the US-led invasion of Iraq began. Moreover, it is not a fixable situation. Because a potentially pro-Israeli regime, or even a neutral regime in Iraq, exists only in the ahistorical and fervid imaginings of US citizen Israeli firsters, who are, when all is said and done, Israel's worst and most lethal enemies. The cost of unqualified US support for Israel has heretofore been measured in the expenditure of dollars and political capital, and as such has been acquiesced in or ignored by Americans who are inured to their government's prodigal waste of national assets. We have now transitioned into a situation where the cost of such support for Israel is going to be measured in the blood and lives of the children of American parents. That cost will quickly become obvious, abhorrent, and utterly unacceptable to those parents. Third, the Congress must find a backbone or be purged beginning in the 2010 midterm elections must find a backbone with which to end its supine abdication to the executive branch of its sole power to declare war, thereby restoring constitutionality and therefore perhaps sanity to the U.S. war-making process. Infamously, no Congress has declared war since December 8, 1941, and yet we repeatedly have seen the American people dragged into wars because one man and his advisors have decided it is the right thing to do. Joint resolutions permitting the president to use military force offensively are cowardly acts that surrender constitutional prerogatives in a manner that allows senators and congressmen to have it both ways. They can applaud the troops if the war goes well, or they can snipe at and undermine the president if the war goes belly up. Our post-war history is littered with failed wars that were initiated by the president and which divided Americans amongst themselves. Perhaps the restoration of the founders' intent on the issue of war making will allow Americans both to win wars abroad in the few wars that are necessary to fight and not to wage war against themselves at home. Fourth, finally, and most important, the U.S. government must stop trying to spread democracy abroad by military, financial, humanitarian, or political intervention. No young American should die for the insane goal of giving the people of Iraq a possibility of embracing democracy, a phrase used ad infinitum by President Bush and other Western leaders. No small R Republican government like ours has the right to spend the lives of its young in military crusades for such a patently obtainable abstractions as giving liberty, justice, gender equality, and democracy to foreigners. This is especially true when the lives of our young people are spent, as they have been and are being spent in Iraq and Afghanistan, by a governing elite that refuses to allow the U.S. military to fully apply the power of the conventional U.S. force American taxpayers have purchased to protect themselves and their families. U.S. foreign policy must revert to what it was before the historical anomaly called the Cold War gave license to U.S. politicians to become democracy-mongering interventionists. Foreign policy is meant to defend our country, not to define who we are by doing good deeds overseas. Foreign policy needs to do only one thing. It must protect America so as to allow the domestic expansion of liberty, freedom, and an equality of condition. If no additional foreigner ever votes in an election, Americans would be no worse off. Washington's effort to build democracies abroad has a track record of making America less safe, not more safe. And may I ask, is there a better definition of pure and unconscionable waste than spending the lives of our Marines or soldiers so Mrs. Mohammed can vote in an Iraqi or an Afghan election? The post-Cold War democracy crusading of U.S. administrations has impoverished us in treasure, blood, and domestic political unity, and also in what Mr. Lincoln called the rightful influence of our Republican example. We must, as a nation, return to the founders' goal for America. That is, to be the well-wisher in freedom and independence for all, but the champion and vindicator only of our own. Taken together, these four steps would begin to restore America's independence of action and to create a non-interventionist foreign policy that would better enable Washington to adequately defend America against the Islamist forces inspired and led by the examples of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Non-interventionism is, of course, not isolationism. The former is a policy, the latter is a mindless knee-jerk slur. A policy of non-intervention would certainly not rule out the U.S. military having to fight the Islamists somewhere in the world, but it probably would, most mercifully, rule out the now near certainty that it will have to fight them everywhere in the world. Washington's steady adherence to a non-interventionist agenda, moreover, would strike a direct and staggering blow at the center of gravity of al-Qaeda and other Islamist organizations. That center of gravity is, turning Clausewitz on his head, the now hoary slate of U.S. foreign policies in the Muslim world. From these policies, bin Laden and other Islamist leaders derive a glue of unity that helps them keep their forces focused on the U.S. target, rather than on targets closer to home. Without U.S. interventionism in their region as a reliable foil, the Islamist leaders' ability to keep their fighters focused on U.S. interests would be severely degraded. And that attention would begin to shift back to the targets against which their violence should be rightfully directed, the Arab tyrannies in Israel. In sum, war with the Islamists is America's war only to the extent that U.S. leaders make it one by continuing to intervene. It is far past time that the United States extricates itself from this quintessentially other people's war and let the genuine protagonists sort it out or fight it out to the death and solve their own problems. My own view is that if we do not disengage significantly, Inauguration Day 2013 is likely to find America in a worse mess in the Muslim world than it is today. And like today's, that mess will be almost entirely of our own making. In closing tonight, let me honor the recent 200th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth by referring to a piece of wisdom that great American left for his posterity to mull over. One that I think President Obama would do well to immediately and fully consider. Long before he won the presidency in 1860, Mr. Lincoln said that if destruction be America's lot, Americans must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. By God's favor, the Union Army's skill and blood, and Mr. Lincoln's steady hand, heart, and mind, America lived through its first attempt at collective suicide during 4 years of civil war. Today, however, we again appear ready to author our own destruction. By willfully ignoring the Islamist motivation for 15 plus years, and by treating our foreign policy as unalterable divine writ, we have left ourselves almost no options that promise victory, a situation that no nation of free men should tolerate. And so we move inexorably toward defeat at the hands of a 4-foot-tall enemy that has been made into a behemoth due to our political leaders' sanctimony, self-deception, and moral cowardice. As long as this status quo remains, we in America neither can expect to, nor do we really deserve to, live through all time as free men. Thank you all very much. I'd be happy to entertain any questions, critiques, comments. If you're going to throw anything, use soft vegetables.
Hello?
Sir.
I'm sure that many of us here tonight agree with some of your conclusions, but have reservations about others. A general policy of non-interventionism is inconsistent with many of the treaty obligations of this country, as with NATO, for example, and it's also incompatible with United States participation in United Nations peacekeeping efforts, it would seem. Could you comment on the possibility of a middle ground between the current policies and the somewhat radical non-interventionism that you're proposing?
Right now, I don't think there is a middle ground, sir. I think the great majority of our politicians in both parties still operate in the Cold War mentality. They believe that alliances are essential at all times in all places. They think the UN is worth committing our troops and our forfeiting our sovereignty to. I am in entire disagreement with that. If our treaty obligations would be violated, then the treaties need to be changed. If we have boxed ourselves in with laws, the laws need to be changed. ultimately, America's only responsibility is to defend itself. And to the extent we are tied by either the United Nations or treaties that prevent that, those have to be changed. There's a great tendency to just throw up your hands and say, well, the alliances won't let us do that. The laws won't let us do that. Well, laws are our specialty. We pass them all the time. They can be changed. And certainly, I think NATO is dying at the moment on Afghanistan's plains, and if they don't get out soon, then that alliance won't be one we'll have to worry about. Sir.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, sir.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks for coming out. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to comment, there was, right before the 2008 election, the Republican Party and John McCain camp put out a documentary. It's called, I think, Fatwa. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of it, sir. I've not seen it.
All right. Well, anyway, basically the presentiment is we're the unilateral global superpower. We need to go around and basically destroy the Islamic boogeyman wherever he may be. And I just wanted to see what you had to say about that, what you thought about.
Yeah. I think it's nonsense, sir. I think that Islamic civilization is as fractured and as ununited as any civilization in the world. It is divided by sectarian splits, by hundreds of languages and dialects, by geographical dispersions. The idea that there's somehow a juggernaut of green Islamism coming at us is a fantasy that exists only in the minds of our politicians in both parties, because they don't want to face up to the fact that they need to talk about policies that are inextricably tied up into domestic politics.
Also, there was a man, obviously, Dr. Ron Paul came out and was speaking about the same exact policies that you were, but he was basically laughed off the stage.
Yeah.
And I would just want to know, what do you think is it going to take in America culturally for us to come to grips with our past and to adopt a non-interventionist type foreign policy?
An extraordinary number of dead Americans in the United States from another attack. And then Americans will begin to see that they've been led down the primrose path, that no one's going to attack the United States because my daughters go to university or because I drink whiskey. They're going to attack us because of what we do overseas. I didn't work for Dr. Paul, but I made a couple of speeches on his behalf during the campaign. And I quite simply think that he's exactly right on this score. And I think you saw the way he was treated during the debate in South Carolina in 2008. He was basically called a traitor and suggested that he should not be able to speak. Unfortunately, that's the way the American political system works at the moment, and only quite literally piles of American corpses are going to change that.
Good evening. And,
Good evening, sir.
Number one, thank you for your service to the United States of America and the CIA. Also, needless to say, much of what you say this evening immediately in a lot of circles would be blasted as anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist. In fact, anytime anybody wishes to take exception to America's foreign policy with Israel, those are the cries. That being said, those who would agree with how you feel about our foreign policy and changing that, how would you best say to go about addressing those individuals or those organizations when one wishes to take your ideas on foreign policy that our stance with Israel is wrong and incorrect, when the slings and arrows of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionists come firing at you?
You just laugh it off and go straight ahead, because there's nothing you can do about it. What is the saying in the Bible? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Well, we have many people in this country who think they can serve two Caesars, America and Israel, and they can't. And whether or not our governing elite ever has the courage to stand up and say, we're tired of you corrupting us through your campaign donations and your media control, I don't know if that will ever happen, sir. But certainly I think the Israelis have put their eggs in the wrong basket if they think the people the parents of Montana or any other American state are going to want their children to be killed to redeem, as President Bush said, God's promise to Abraham made X number of thousand of years ago. But there's nothing you can do about being language that would be libelous in any other kind of format is easily used against anyone who suggests that our relationship with Israel is counterproductive. There's just nothing you can do about that, except, speak your mind. As long as my kids don't think I'm anti-Semitic, I'll go ahead, I guess.
Thank you very much. It's been a very enlightening lecture. And I have one question, and if in any way I'm misconstruing what you have said, please correct me. But in a hypothetical situation, after we've achieved this isolation, re-achieved this isolationist policy, perhaps, so that, as you said, violence will be rightly directed towards Israel and no longer towards the U.S. After we've withdrawn
I said Israel and the Arab states, didn't I?
Yes, you said Israel and the despotic Arab states. And after we've withdrawn our support from Israel and from other countries like Georgia, I'm not going to say from the tyrannic Islamic states, after that's happened, would we be able to say we have achieved peace in our time?
I don't know. Perhaps we could say we have achieved security for America, which, after all, is the goal of the United States government, unless you believe in doing good around the world for the sake of other people, which I don't. I also reject the idea that America has ever been isolationist. The point is always made that we were isolationist after World War I, and of course, the greatest expansion of the American economy overseas occurred between 1919 and 1939. The world would still trade with us. We would still trade with the world. We've been active overseas in scientific endeavors, educational endeavors. You can be active in the world without being militarily interventionist. And I just simply reject the idea that America, it's not possible for America to be isolationist. I'm sorry, I can't see if someone's over there.
There's one here.
All right, sir.
Thank you for being here. And generally, I appreciate your articulate analysis. In many cases, I agree with much of what you've outlined. And there are a few areas that trouble me that offer some large gaps. And I don't know, I assume that that's partly a result of brevity tonight in your analysis. As you talk about the corporate ruling elite, news media, governing elite, and we've been recently engaged in this nightmare of fighting so-called freedom and democracy for Islamic fascio states and so forth. But as you know, having worked in the CIA for decades, almost all of America's involvement in international affairs has been economically based. It's been corporate based. It's been based in a capitalist notion about controlling empire for our own economic interests. So I haven't heard you looking at that broader picture or analyzing or critiquing that broader picture of how much of America's economic well-being is based in our empire that has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. It has everything to do with preserving empire for the sake of American economic interests, many of ours in this room here tonight. And so that's one area that I would like you to address is how do we start cutting off some of the tentacles of American imperialism that's tied to our economic interests. And the other part of that is that when you talk about cutting us free from the energy producers of the world, particularly in the Mideast, Mexico, and turning to nuclear, alternative energy, etc., you haven't talked about radical, dramatic conservation in this country to save American Marines and soldiers from going abroad, fighting for this oil empire. If we dramatically cut back on our consumptive lifestyle, we could easily cut back on some of our immediate energy needs for the Mideast oil. So these two are inextricably tied, this economic global imperialism that the United States has stood for in its foreign policy forever, virtually, and then our energy independence is also tied towards that same basic issue.
Well, I would think that conservation would go without saying, but you're right, I should have included it in this talk. That has to be part of it. But the most important part of it is simply to move in a direction that gets us out from, that restores to us the ability to decide when or not, when we won't fight. In terms of business, I simply think that we're facing an era in which perhaps American business overseas will not be able to depend on the United States government intervening on their behalf as much as they did in the past. It's kind of as night follows day. We're probably going to be a poorer country, but we'll be a more secure one. I don't know how else to get around that problem. I think it's a very serious problem. But business, to some extent, business and especially Christian missionaries are going to have to be reassured by the government that the cavalry is not coming anymore. There's no way around it.
Thank you.
And I think on conservation, I really do think, sir, that if we had a leader that was worth his salt, the American people are by nature willing to sacrifice. If we had somebody in the White House from either party that was willing to level with the American people and say what needs to be done, they would get a very positive response. But, you know, we're at war, but go shopping at the mall is the kind of leadership we get at the moment. Sir.
As a veteran of the Marine Corps Infantry and spending time in Iraq and coming face to face what my fellow student called the so-called Islamic boogeyman, knowing that democracy in Iraq is not possible just because of the views and the traditions of that area of the world, and agreeing with you with Iraq, but with Afghanistan, this country was attacked and over 3,000 Americans did die. So what should be the proper response in finishing off what we've started there as a military operation that was in response to a direct attack on this country?
The reference to the Islamic bogeyman is not one that I meant to endorse as there being no threat. But I don't think it's a threat that looks like communism or Nazism or Imperial Japan. The president, Mr. Bush, had a window of savagery. He could have done absolutely anything in the first 15 months after 9/11, and the only achievable mission in Afghanistan from the very start was to destroy as much of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda as we could and get out. It's too late for that now. It should be disappointing to all Americans that no general resigned this week after telling the president, if you're going to send 17,000 more troops to Afghanistan, don't bother, because it's a drop in the bucket of an endless bucket. My own view is that there's no one in this government who has the courage to even state the word victory. And so we're going to lose in Afghanistan. And before the year is up, I believe, President Obama is going to have to make a decision to either to lose Afghanistan or to lose Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so I think he's going to cut Afghanistan loose. I hope in the next, in the next year we kill as many of the enemy as we can. But otherwise, we don't have enough soldiers to take and Marines to take to Afghanistan. If he was talking about a 250,000 troops and actually fighting, he might have a chance, but he's not. It's another lost war, not because our military isn't the best and most powerful in the world, but it's another war lost because the politicians don't want to win.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Daniel Henning. I had a dual question. The first is, I understand that that a lot of Middle Eastern people with the CIA were sort of thrown out because of conservative and fundamental Christians and all that didn't want these bad guys in or something. And so consequently, CIA lost a tremendous amount of its knowledge and perspective on the whole thing. And then the second thing is the idea that whatever you're saying tonight, how it really relates to the biodiversity worldwide. I mean, and to what's going to happen, because in essence, given global warming, everybody's in that. But I'm talking about protecting whatever we have in nature, biodiversity, and this type of thing, given the way much of what you're saying now seems to be going. Thank you.
I'm afraid, sir, I don't know much about biodiversity or global warming. I think that's somebody else's bailiwick. In terms of our knowledge about the Middle East, Mr. Clinton, in his administration, imagined that clandestine intelligence could be collected to protect America by recruiting people who were the equivalent of Presbyterian ministers. The funny thing about terrorism is you probably can't collect information unless you're willing to deal with terrorists who have a gripe against their leaders. So we lost a great number of assets who could have helped us, and those are not easily recoverable. Americans, I think, either are uncomfortable or tend to forget that the CIA officer's job is to convince other people to commit treason. And that's very dangerous work, and it's very time-consuming work. And when you decide you can't deal with bad guys, as Mr. Clinton did, you really do cripple the clandestine service.
Hello, thank
Sure.
you for coming out here. I have a question based off the fact that you quoted the Founding Fathers a lot, so I'm assuming that you respect their opinions and their political thoughts. And so when you're talking about us not having an obligation to reach out and help other countries who are trying to create democracies, I wonder how you'd respond to the fact that our Founding Fathers themselves, when they wanted to create a democracy, reached out to other nations for help to do so, and the French helped us, and because the French helped us, now we have America, which you and I both love. And so it seems to me that following a principle of reciprocity, that we should be willing to...
The founders themselves didn't follow reciprocity. They dumped France as soon as they could during the Revolution. It's very clear that, you know, not only in Washington's farewell address, but in the entangling alliances term doesn't come from Washington, it comes from Jefferson. They were very clear, and the one way to destroy the American Republic is to try to duplicate it overseas, in places where we don't understand the political system, the tribal organizations, or the religion. I think in extremis you grab at what you could, and we certainly were an extremist when we were fighting the 18th century superpower. But we didn't go to the aid of the French during their revolution, and it caused a great consternation in America, but we didn't go. Much to the credit of the Federalists, I think.
Well, it just seems like the world that you're creating is a world in which when we start to fall down, no one's going to be there to come to our aid.
And does it matter? You know, who's going to come to whoever comes to our aid? You know, we're afraid we're going to lose alliance, friends, and partners. Well, people are always going to take our money and our protection. What do we get in return? What do we get from the Israelis? We get requests for ever increasing amounts of our hardware and money. What do we get from what we give to the Palestinians? We watch them turn the money into graft and corruption. You know, what do we get out of NATO now? You know, the mighty Belgian core, where is that?
Thank you.
At some point, there has to be a balance. You know, it's fine to say we need friends, but if the friends aren't doing a lot. But American politicians, we were talking this afternoon, for those of you who have teenage girls, if you take them and their friends to a restaurant or to some event, none of them can go to the bathroom alone. They kind of go in a group. And that's kind of the way American presidents are. We get attacked on 9/11. The first thing they want to do is go to the John, but we got to have the French and the Germans and the British and Romanians and South Koreans and Poles, and you know, it's a kind of a ludicrous situation, really. 9/11 was an act of war against the United States. It wasn't an attack on Western civilization, and we got to get with it, I think.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for coming. I liked a lot of your talk. A couple things. It's pretty much mainstream now that Georgia attacked Russia, and it was a Russian counterattack that came in and went through, and that they actually started the war. But in your stuff with Jeffersonian, and also talking about Osama bleeding us to bankruptcy, Jefferson clearly stated that he feared banks far more than armies.
Yeah, here, it's a good point these days, isn't it?
And quite frankly, well, yeah, it's the bankers, this international cadre of bankers that own the Federal Reserve Bank that was set up, and this is something that Jefferson warned us about many times, who are actually bankrupting the people. Most people don't know the real number. I was one of Ron Paul's supporters. I've talked to him personally several times. I'm glad you were with him. So I'd like to go with that. And quite frankly, the biggest thing that drives this is this, what everyone agrees about is something happened on 9/11, and that whoever did it is still out there. And there are serious questions with anybody who has even a very limited amount of understanding of American capabilities, that what has been portrayed to us as the truth is the truth. That someone flew a plane into the most heavily guarded skies in the world without any response from hot jets, from all the bases around there, and the buildings that magically fell down. And you know that there are CIA people who you probably know that have said it was an inside job.
Well, everybody has their right to say what they want and think what they want. And if I know enough from being an intelligence officer to never say never. But the evidence that's available to date is indubitably showing Al-Qaeda did the attack on 9/11. I don't know any way around that. It may sometime be proved differently, but right now you go with the evidence, what the evidence says. But I think someone wrote that only in America could the U.S. military figure continental defense was not really their job. And I think there's something to that. The Soviet Union was gone. They weren't expecting the mighty Chadian Air Force to fly across the ocean and come get us, so they weren't ready. Look at where we are now. Where is the plan to control the borders, either north or south? There isn't any. We have kind of defined defense as an overseas activity rather than a homeland. Notwithstanding the fact we have this enormous bureaucracy for homeland defense.
Bob Campbell, Montana Senior Citizens News. I have a two-part question, and I'll sit down. First, today on National Public Radio, it identified one of three buildings on the Pakistani side of the Afghan border, you probably heard it, that one of those three buildings houses Osama bin Laden.
Yes,
now, under the Bush or Obama preemptive doctrine, should we destroy those immediately? And number two, if he was killed in one of those three buildings, without a change in your 6 factors that created this mess after Iraq, would it make any difference on our national policies?
Well, we were talking over dinner on this, and what they didn't tell you was that in the other 2 compounds are Jimmy Hoffa and Judge Crater. So we would have to decide which one is Osama. I don't know quite the methodology that they used, sir, but they said it's in the Parichinar area of the border. Parichinar is among the most busy parts of that entire border. If he was going to hide, he's not going to hide there. But again, I don't know what their methodology was. Yes, it would make a difference. He is a great man in every sense of the word, every negative sense in the word. Better, people raise that, why make him a martyr? And I always say, better a dead martyr than a hands-on leader. He's a very odd combination of an 8th century theologian and a 21st century CEO. He heads the only organization in the Muslim world that is multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic. He's an extraordinary man, and he deserves to be dead. Yeah, well, we could get all 3 buildings, but he's not going to, I don't think he's going to be there, sir. Maybe then they could go after the professors rather than me for rendition. It might work okay. I'd be interested to hear his methodology, though. Okay, sir.
Thank you for coming, Doctor.
You're welcome. Thank you.
First, one note about your rhetoric, that you quoted 2 of the so-called greatest Americans ever, and that seems extreme to me. I know a man in the front row who saved the financial director of this whole university. There are many great Americans out there. I think, your superlatives could be adjusted. However,
I'll stand by them, sir. Lincoln and Washington are the two greatest Americans.
Very good. Okay.
Next to my dad.
See, I feel the same way about people I know, too. In your speech, you mentioned that administrations for the past 30 years have propped up dictators in various parts of the world trying to spread democracy and, pursue that ideal. And I agree with you that our resources are better spent elsewhere. However, why didn't you start earlier than that with a threat that, confronts Americans today as far as the government is concerned, and that's Iran? 50 years ago, the Pahlavi regime was supported by the CIA. And they continued that support until he was overthrown by the population there. And the CIA seems to have continued to support unpopular dictators for a long time.
Exactly right.
How do you suppose we'll change that?
Change presidents. Americans as a whole tend to think that somehow the CIA operates independently of the president. Of all the agencies of the United States government, the CIA is peculiarly the tool of the President of the United States. What the CIA does is at the direction of the President, whether it's Mr. Eisenhower, Mr. Kennedy, or Mr. Obama. If the government of Iran was to be overthrown, it was to be overthrown on the direction of the President. If we are ordered to support the Israelis, it's done at the direction of the President. So if you want to change what the CIA is doing, then you change presidents or you pass laws that inhibit the president's ability to use the CIA. It's not that hard. We're a service organization.
One more. So how come, the 20 years before the last 30 years you talk about wasn't talked about in the speech? Or I haven't read your book, I'm sorry. Maybe you could sell one. Is it in the book?
No, I talked about, I had to pick a starting point somewhere, and I picked 1973 because of the oil embargo. And what else happened in 73? The Arab-Israeli War of 73 and the oil embargo. But my point remains valid. If you're upset with the CIA, you're upset with the president. I'm upset with the president, but who cares? Sir.
Hey there. Thank you, sir, for showing up as a supporter of Ron Paul. I very much enjoyed your speech. My question is in regards to, you were talking about resigning from Iraq and all of those sort of Arab states. How do you view Obama's plan as it stands now to get out of Iraq by 2012 and such?
He won't be going anywhere. We're not leaving Iraq. If we leave Iraq, we absolutely compromise Israeli security to an extent that the lobby won't permit. Israel's greatest ally against terrorism and ours was Saddam Hussein. As long as he was there in power, he was the cork in the neck of the bottle. The jihadis were staying in Southwest Asia. Once we took Saddam down, we built them a westward highway through Iraq, into the Levant, into Turkey, into the Arab Peninsula, and through those places into Europe and North Africa. So my own guess, and I could be entirely wrong, but Mr. Obama will withdraw a few more thousand American troops, but then you'll start hearing reasons why we can't leave. We don't want a civil war. They're not ready to stand up the army on their own. Democracy hasn't taken hold. But the reality is, Israel is screwed to the door if we leave Iraq.
I agree.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Mine's really more a question of advice. It's going to be really my generation that's kind of stuck cleaning this all up. And we've really got to deal with our more financially motivated parents and the more flamboyantly patriotic of our generation. So what advice would you give us when dealing with or trying to let them see that this needs to change?
My own advice to the students that I teach is to learn your own country's history. The things we do in the world today are just not consonant with the country we're supposed to be. America was supposed to be an example to the world and not to be the imposer of our views and systems of government. I think good advice is always to mind your own business. We don't seem to have anybody who can do that at the moment.
I'd like to thank you again for coming out to Montana tonight.
It's been my honor, sir.
Thank you very much. If we go ahead and remove ourselves militarily from the Middle East and we let Israel fall by the wayside, what's the picture look like then?
I think what you're going to have is a long inter-Islamic series of wars, revolutions, and score settlings. Ultimately, the problem in the Islamic world can only be solved by Muslims themselves. And that will be probably a prolonged and bloody mess. And there's not a lot we can do but get in the way and suffer because of getting in the way. I don't think there's any happy story, a happy ending to any of this, except if we can limit the damage we suffer as a result of their, working through their own problems.
So when we close our doors and the whole world crumbles over there, don't the pieces get swept under our doorframe?
Only if we continue the insane immigration policies we have at the moment, I think.
Okay.
I spoke in California, and I thought it would be a real easy debate on the question before the House was, is border control an essential part of national defense? And they gave me the yes, and I thought, this is easy. The vote ended up to be like 476 to 9 for the other guy, that border control was really racism. So who knows if we're capable of defending ourselves? We're clearly not capable of winning wars anymore because the politicians won't let the military win wars. We're watching Mexico slide into a very dangerous situation, and what have you heard in the stimulus package about closing the border or controlling the border? Zero.
Not a whole lot.
Nothing. The Republicans and Democrats, one of them do it for humanitarian reasons. The other ones want the border open for cheap labor. And I don't know what it's going to take to be able to say, really, border control has always been an essential part of national sovereignty. But that doesn't look like it's on the cards anytime soon.
My name is Snachur Abbas, and I'm from Pakistan. So I'm going to ask you a few questions, but in a very short way. Is the settlement between Shia and Sunnis, is there a responsibility of United States of America? And the second thing is war against terror or war against Muslim world. Is that two things the same thing or different thing?
I'm not sure. I don't think the United States has any possibility of settling whatever disputes are existent between Shias and Sunnis. I think that's something that's going to have to be settled by people who are involved in it.
Yeah, but I hear these things few times in a TV, like the senators sit down and talk about the settlement or establishment between Shias and Sunnis. And I think the Shiaism is different, is everywhere in the world, like especially in the Muslim world. They live in a different kind of lifestyle. So I don't think so that America should consider those problems that they have between each other. I think their own countries settle those problems. They cannot open lots of borders, especially war. Sometimes you read in the newspaper like America going to have a war against terror for the next 25 years, war against Muslim world, And sending more and more troops, that's not the solution to killing people or trying to make a peace on that region that never ever be peace there. And whatever the American government do, that those people solve their own establishment, especially between Shias and Sunnis. And the main thing for that settlement, especially in Pakistan, it's been settled for a long time and then it's been disturbed when this war against terror started. So people want to involve those people in politics, but America shouldn't take a responsibility between these two things because Muslim world's never interference between Catholics and Protestants.
I think I agree with you completely. And there's one thing that you should know about American commentators is they can solve any problem that exists because all problems are negotiable. That's what our kids are taught. That's what the media believes. And certainly the idea that Richard Holbrooke, for example, is going to negotiate between Shias and Sunnis an equitable agreement after 900 years or however many hundred years of animosities is certainly silly. But, you know, we are all things to all people.
I think they should drop these things. This is good for humanity, I think.
Well,
It's
you know,
make less bloodshed, I think.
my own view is it's none of our business.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
What a treat to have you here. Thank
Well,
you
you're
so
very
much.
kind, ma'am. You ought to get out more, though.
Well, no, please don't think me of Bill O'Reilly, okay? I'm a lot softer. You touched upon Mexico, and the Wall Street Journal this weekend had a piece.
I read that, yes.
Yes, a piece on Mexico, on the probable decline and fall of the Mexican government due to the drug wars. My question to you is, I do not want to see us, the United States, be the sole interveners in trying to stabilize the Mexican government. What would be your solution, because they are our immediate neighbor to the south?
I think the first solution is to protect ourselves. And if we're going to withdraw troops from Iraq, they ought to go to the border and to make sure that we get the immigrants we need in an orderly manner. I'm not sure that we have to worry about a lot of people lining up to help us save Mexico. I think that the Europeans at least will do what they always do and let Uncle Sam do what it needs. I'm not sure what we would do. We don't have enough troops to do what we need at the moment. How are we going to do anything in Mexico? Although I think if anything disturbed the production of oil, somehow we would have to do something to restore it. But Mexico is extraordinarily corrupt. It is, you know, if you read the Wall Street Journal, the gangs and the cartels are on both sides of the border. We let them operate almost as openly in America as they do in Mexico. So much, I think, the answer to all of these problems is common sense. What we've kind of lost as a government is an organizing concept. And it seems to me the only organizing concept for the federal government is to protect the United States. And until we get somebody who's willing to say, well, you know, in wartime, an American life is worth more than the bad guy, we're going to continue to flounder. So I really don't know what the answer is. I don't know much about Mexico. What I'm concerned with, though, is as violence increases, the ability to disguise you know, Arabs moving into our country over the southern border. And the mainstream media never reports it. But if you look in Google, the Texas newspapers every month, or the Arizona newspapers, have, you know, so many Syrians, so many Egyptians we caught coming across the border and sent back. So the problem is there. We, of course, don't know how many get through that we don't catch. But it's a disaster. You know, again, so much of this is our own making. And in many ways, we're our own worst enemies at the moment.
Hi, thanks for coming tonight. My name's Ryan. My question for you is, if we did pretty much withdraw completely from Iraq and Afghanistan, which you seem to be advocating, what type of government or order do you feel or do you estimate would form if we withdrew? And also, in my view, we have some sort of responsibility on some level to some of the events currently occurring there, especially in Iraq, a country that we overthrew the government of. And how can you believe that we'll actually be safer after going to war in these countries and then leaving them before the job's done?
Well, we're not going to do the job, are we? First of all, we defined a job that's not possible. We destroyed the Taliban, which had brought the first nationwide law and order and security in Afghanistan for 25 years. And instead of replacing that with another system, we immediately moved to elections and parliaments and everything else. And now what have we got? We had the opportunity to do what we needed to do in Afghanistan, and it didn't entail gender equality, and it didn't entail democracy. It entailed military action. We didn't do it. We're done. In Iraq, that was a war that should never have been fought. But once it started, we should have never done anything short of victory there. And victory looks like a situation where our leading policymakers don't think Iraq is a threat to the United States anymore. But we didn't do that either. Iraq is going to unravel, and the whole region probably is going to have a problem. In terms of one of the great dangers is that we're conducting foreign policy as if there was a moral dimension to it. The moral dimension of policy is at home, in making sure women can vote in America, in making sure everyone has an opportunity to succeed, that everyone can vote in elections. That's a legal and a moral basis. Foreign policy is about interests and material well-being. And when we confuse the two, which we have, we end up in these messes as we are in Afghanistan and Iraq at the moment. So I'm very comfortable with foreign policy that would have no moral dimension to it, beyond giving wheat or medicine or to people who need it, but certainly not a foreign policy that thinks that because gender equality is swell in America, we ought to force it onto Afghans.
Thank you, sir. John Klingman here. If actionable intelligence was to become available onto the whereabouts of bin Laden, given that be Iran, should and could the United States extract him?
I don't think we should. I think the last thing in the world we would ever want to do is to capture him. You want him dead. We probably could extract him, but then you have him in the Southern District of New York on CNN for 3 years.
But do you think we could actually get him out of Iran? Do we have the capabilities?
I think the U.S. military is willing to try almost anything they're assigned to do, but the problem is that, go back to the Afghan war just for a second. We held up our military offensive in Afghanistan until we had enough search and rescue on the scene, because what the White House was afraid of is having one U.S. pilot captured. So the question is, can we do it? I suspect the answer is yes. Will we do it? I think the answer would be no.
In forums like these, frequently we hear criticisms of the CIA and the president and international corporations, but you mentioned pretty much total failure of academia. We're in an academic setting now, so I always like to hear a little further elaboration of that. Maybe intellectuals aren't as smart as they think they are sometimes.
Well, I think they're all very smart. My own bias is that I get kids in graduate school at Georgetown who don't know the first thing about any foreign nation's history and almost nothing about our own. When I was young, which is of course 100 years ago, we learned in some degree our own history, and at least something like the Crusades, we learned what that was about and how it worked. At Georgetown, I get kids who, well, there was a crusade on cancer, and there was a crusade on drugs, and this and that. I think you'll recognize Oxford Press does a series of very short introductions to X, logic, philosophy, Quran. I had to get the one for my class to put on the reading list, a very short introduction to the Crusades, because those kids got all the way to graduate school in Georgetown and really didn't have a clue about what the Crusades were all about, and about anything in America before 1970. They're almost as resistant to it as policymakers are. Our children are not well educated in history. In foreign policy, they think the only foreign policy America ever has had is the one we have at the moment. I had to go and assign Walter McDougall's book, Promised Land, Crusader State, to have these kids figure out that there were other approaches to foreign policy than what he calls global meliorism. I most find that almost no children young people in graduate school have any ability to do any critical thinking. They have had the judgmental idea drilled into them that you can't make judgments or decisions about other peoples and other cultures. And of course, if you can't make a judgment, you're just about useless to yourself and certainly to your country. So the lack of critical thinking abilities And I was raised by a Marine and educated by Jesuits, so I'm pretty used to being able to make a decision and make a judgment. But that's not the case anymore, and I think it hurts our country. At base, we have done a miserable job in educating our children, at least in the liberal arts, over the past 30 years or more.
Thank you for being here tonight, sir. Oh, over here.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
You're fine. I would briefly like to take the discussion back to Afghanistan for a
Yes.
second. It seems to me that in the historical context of the country, that the U.S.'s hands-off approach to the country, especially after the Soviet war fought over there, created a very unstable atmosphere, brought in weapons, brought in militant Islamicism, and essentially created room for the Taliban. And I was just wondering, in the present, if a hands-off approach would not just create a resurgence of the Taliban even more than it is right now, and also to expand off that question, it seems to me that there are only two options that you've outlined: either throw in a whole bunch more troops, which we don't have and our allies aren't willing to supply, or to leave and become non-interventionalist. Do you think there's any way that the United States could negotiate with the Taliban?
Oh,
I'm
they'd
just
love to, yeah. Of course
wondering
they
about
would.
your thoughts on that.
They would negotiate with us in a minute. They'd take part of the government, and then as soon as they were gone, they'll take the whole government. You know, they think they're winning at the moment, so any negotiation is going to be simply to ease their way into power politically rather than through violence. And I think the point I tried to make on history is very pertinent here. Only two methods, three methods if you count the Mongols, that method is probably not on the cards. Only two things have ever worked for foreigners in Afghanistan. In the 1880s, the British ran a punitive mission that kept the Afghans quiet for about 20 years. And 3 centuries before Christ, Alexander brought out a lot of Greek colonists and colonized part of Afghanistan. And that held up for 2 centuries. We're too late for the punitive part, and I don't think many Americans want to colonize Herat. So I don't mean to be flip, but I don't see an upside. I don't see anything we can do to avoid disaster in Afghanistan. It's not a static situation. For the United States of America, 8 years after a war began, to be trying to figure out what order of battle we need in this war speaks of incompetence of extraordinary dimensions.
Would you agree that the United States has some responsibility to the country after these years of war?
No.
No.
I don't. We have a responsibility to ourselves, and the devil take the hindmost.
Okay.
I realize that the Israeli-Palestine side of this is a small piece of the puzzle you described tonight, but I wonder what you think of Jimmy Carter's recent 2 books, whether he has something to say to the American people which doesn't seem to be being heard, or whether you think he's naive or whether you think he's wrong. And the second part is, because he speaks from such a religious perspective, which is peppered throughout his life, I wonder what place you feel your personal religious or moral perspective or our countries should play a part in the things you're saying, or do you see these as political and social and cultural and not from a religious perspective?
I think Mr. Carter is a very naive man, but I also think he was the President of the United States. And for him to be treated by the media, and especially by the Israeli-controlled media, as a man who's an idiot or an anti-Semite is despicable. And he has as much right to be heard as anyone else does. Whether he's right or wrong, I don't know. I think I've made it clear tonight that I don't think it's worth the trouble of trying to negotiate a settlement with it. I think the time has passed for a two-state solution. What do I believe in? I guess the Lord's Prayer, the Declaration, the Constitution, and the New York Yankees. And none of those things would shape my foreign policy views. I don't think religion should have much of a place in foreign policy at all. I think it should, at home it should be flourishing, but if it can flourish on its own hook. But to go overseas, as we have allowed many of the evangelicals to do, to go overseas as supposedly aid givers, but really conversion machines. I think that's not in our interest to do.
Yes, it's great to have you here, Doctor.
Thank you, sir.
I just recently read an interview with Osama bin Laden, and he quotes where he justifies the killing of all the Americans in 9/11 inside the World Trade Center as saying that they were not innocent people, that they were spreading mischief and dispute among the Islamic world, and that we have been doing much in our power to terrorize them, and that we have, bombed innocent schools and people all over there. And I was just wondering what your comment on his thoughts about that are.
Well, I think he said some of that. I think what he said is perfectly, it makes perfect sense to me. The World Trade Center was attacked because it was a center of American economic power, and because they believe it was a center of Jewish control in the United States. And they attacked the Pentagon, which of course is a tremendously pertinent military power. And of course the greatest victory they had on 9/11 was the fact that they didn't hit the Congress, and so we didn't get a chance to change that organization. I think we do a lot of whining about the innocents that died on 9/11. War is a tough business, and for the boys who brought you the firebombing of Tokyo and Dresden, it takes a lot of nerve to whine about losing 3,000 civilians. And I personally think Dresden and Tokyo were entirely called for, but you at least have to be adult about it. If you're going to do something, somebody's going to do it back to you at some point.
Thank you.
Okay. There's only two left, I think. Can we do both?
Hi, thanks for coming tonight. I have a question about how realistic minding our own business is in an era of globalization. This doesn't have anything to do with Afghanistan or Iraq, but more in relation to our border. And I've found that our trade agreements with Mexico and Central America have possibly led to farmers and other people who haven't been able to sort of maintain their livelihoods in the face of our trade agreements, come up to the States to work. And so I'm wondering how we can sort of be non-interventionist in economic terms.
Well, we can control the number of people that come into our country. And I think, I think globalization is kind of the play toy of the intellectuals. It seems to me that the intellectuals and the business people are globalizers, and at base, most people are still nationalists. I think we're a long way from a global economy, and I think you're going to see cracks in this great globalization hegemon coming up very shortly. I wish I knew more about those trade agreements. Free trade in the United States has become kind of what Protestantism was in the 19th century. It's a religion. And I think in many cases, or at least in some cases, free trade hurts us more than it helps us. But I don't know. I'm just not competent to answer your question, ma'am. I don't know.
Thanks. I would just argue that we're intervening quite actively in many countries.
On the business side, I think that's exactly, the gentleman who made the point tonight was exactly right, and I should have made it myself. That at some point, American business is not going to be able to count on the American government coming to their rescue. Perhaps sooner rather than later.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, for what it's worth.
Sorry to be back up here again.
That's okay.
I guess the real question I was asking last time I asked a question was whether a hands-off approach would just be a repeat of history in which I think your point or your argument is well taken that the only responsibility the United States has in intervening in foreign affairs is when there's a threat posed to domestic policy. Am I right with that one?
Well, domestic security, I think.
Domestic security.
Yes. I certainly don't think we are a country who should thrive on unprovoked wars.
I agree with you completely. But I think that non-intervention in this example, after being there for as many years as we have, destroying infrastructure and such, would just create a scapegoat as the United States for the Taliban to unite the area against the United States, which would pose a threat.
Well, the Taliban and the Afghans in general are very insular people, probably next to Americans. Afghans are the most insular folks. Their vision seldom goes beyond the border of Afghanistan. And we could do far worse in terms of regional stability than to see the Taliban come back in power, if we can make sure we have destroyed as much of al-Qaeda as we can.
So the Taliban in complete power of Afghanistan doesn't pose a threat to the United States
It
security?
wouldn't, without al-Qaeda, it certainly wouldn't have. It offended Mrs. Clinton and Miss Albright because they didn't have women's rights like we have.
Okay.
The idea that somehow America's future is dependent on who rules in Kabul is a stretch for me. And what we didn't learn, the kind of urban legend is that we abandoned the Afghans after the Soviets left, and we didn't help them. Well, the truth is, we did in 1990 and 91 and 92 exactly what we're doing now. In fact, one of the two lead people on our effort to build a government in Afghanistan were Zalmay Khalilzad, who was there for us in this edition, and Karzai's father. The problem we had was not that we abandoned Afghanistan, but we didn't. We tried to put into power former communists, people who spent the war against the Soviets in India or Europe, technocrats, anybody but someone who had a beard and was carrying an AK.
Didn't the United States support the Taliban somewhat through oil over there? It seems like they're mixed interests.
What we did was we supported the Taliban in the sense that we would not play rough with them because the Clinton administration wanted to get a contract with them for Unicom to run a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan through southern Afghanistan to Karachi.
So I guess my point is, if we're going to have a non-interventionalist policy towards Afghanistan, then it should be an honest one.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Michael Scheuer, and thank you all for being here tonight. Good night.